over to Rock Creek Park, up to White Oak, over to Prince George's County. Except for very few exceptions, African Americans were unable to buy property, they were unable to rent property. The only way African Americans could live in any of those subdivided lots was if they were a domestic servant of the property owner. Littonsville, the original Littonsville plat belonging to Samuel Litton and his heirs, and the Perkins and Burroughs properties were exceptions to that rule. So as Silver Spring was developing, subdividers like E. Brooke Lee, Frank Hewitt, the Sissels bought substantial numbers of former farmlands, subdivided them, and then sold them to people. And they sold them to all white people. The first evidence of racial restrictive covenants appearing in Silver Spring occurs in 1904. A man named Robert Holt Easley, who was an attorney and land speculator from Halifax, Virginia, bought about 67 acres in and around downtown Silver Spring near the old railroad station. In 1904, he began subdividing those properties, and the deeds to the first sales contained the first language that we have restricting African Americans from living in Silver Spring. He prohibited the occupation of those properties by anyone of African descent. Between 1904 and 1948, when the U.S. Supreme Court rendered those racial restrictive covenants unenforceable, more than 70 residential subdivisions had been created in what's now known as Greater Silver Spring. Most of those either by the developers themselves by filing independent declarations of covenants specifically excluding African Americans, or by individual property owners attaching racial covenants to their deeds, created a community that you could look at census returns for, say, North Woodside in the 1930s and 1940 and find a handful, less than a dozen of African Americans living there, all of them domestic servants. Silver Springs Business District developed similarly. Silver Springs Business District, which grew along Colesville Road and Georgia Avenue, was built by the same individuals who were involved in the real estate speculation. Men like E. Brooke Lee, Frank Hewitt. They built banks, they built stores, they sold property for other business people to come in and build wealth and build community. Up until the passage of civil rights laws in the 1960s, not the desegregation of schools by Brown v. Board, but actually the creation of an open accommodations law in 1962 by Montgomery County and an open housing law in 1968, African Americans were rigidly excluded from most public spaces in Silver Spring. E. Brooke Lee himself, who was considered the father of modern Silver Spring, was a former Maryland legislator, the founder of the Maryland National Capital Planning Commission, founding inspiration for the Montgomery County Civic Federation, and much of the social infrastructure that we now have in Montgomery County was an unrepentant racist. And unfortunately, the histories of Montgomery County and Silver Spring don't even mention that. To give you an example, Lee's properties, every one of the subdivisions that he created were racially restricted. Given the opportunity to adapt to the times as Brown v. Board was decided and as racial barriers started coming down voluntarily and later by law, E. Brooke Lee stuck to his guns. Even as late as 1967, laws that we now call civil rights laws, laws like the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Law, he was describing them as anti-white laws. He wrote articles for local newspapers that described these proposed laws that were under consideration as dire threats to white suburbs. These were the suburbs that he and his family invested in, created, and built up into the community that we now love. One of the reasons that I guess we're standing here today is this bridge is going to disappear. Historians over the past 15, 20 years have studied these communities intensively. They've looked at legal records, they've talked to residents, they've looked at records in historical societies, and with all of that, it wasn't until last year that folks all of a sudden discovered this bridge has a history beyond just being a bunch of old metal and wood attached to the railroad. The people in the Littonsville community had deep emotional attachment to this bridge. This bridge was their lifeline to the rest of the world. This bridge, if you look at it in a historical context, that was the other side of the tracks. This bridge not only is an artifact of white supremacist racial segregation, and I know that word upsets a lot of folks, but it's just a fact of life. You don't exclude people because you love them. You don't exclude people because you have mixed feelings about them. You exclude them because you don't want them near you. This bridge, as an artifact of white supremacist exclusion, is also a powerful symbol of resilience of that community. And we have another bridge, another train. So when you think of the disappearance of the bridge, think of the disappearance of cycle time. We have no